Picture this. We're in Europe, roughly 40,000 years ago. The entire continent is completely locked in a bitter, absolutely unforgiving ice age. And you've got two incredibly resourceful groups of hominins just trying to survive these freezing conditions. On one hand, you have the Neanderthals, who have already been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. On the other, you have the newly arrived early modern humans.
Now, you might be wondering, how on earth do we even know what they wore? It's a great question, and honestly, it's the central hurdle of this entire investigation. We know both groups lived in glacial Europe during what scientists call oxygen isotope stage 3, which, by the way, is basically just a fancy academic way of saying a period of unimaginably severe cold. But here's the problem. Because animal hides, sinew, and natural fibers decompose incredibly fast in the Earth, we're left with a massive blank spot in the archaeological record. We don't have a single scrap of ancient fabric or hide from this era to examine. Nothing. So how do archaeologists figure out what a Neanderthal or an early modern human draped over their shoulders during a blizzard? Well, we have to look for indirect clues. And as you'll see, the sheer ingenuity researchers used to solve this is nothing short of brilliant.
Let's break down what we do know. When it comes to early modern humans, the archaeological record gives us some pretty hard proof. We have actual physical evidence in the form of delicate bone needles and specialized stone hide scrapers. This tells us they were almost certainly making fitted, highly insulative, tailored cold weather gear. I mean, they were literally sewing pieces together. But for Neanderthals? Crickets. The record is stubbornly quiet. Because we just don't find sewing needles in their ancient campsites, researchers have traditionally been split between three competing theories. Hypothesis 1, they didn't wear clothes at all, relying purely on their own biology. Hypothesis 2, they wore basic cape-like clothing, kind of just draping an animal hide over their shoulders like a poncho. Or Hypothesis 3, maybe they actually did make tailored clothing, just like early modern humans, but they used different perishable tools that we just haven't found yet.
To finally crack this cold case, a team of researchers published an absolutely fascinating study in the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology, and they applied this brilliant forensic workaround. They realized, hey, if the fabric doesn't survive, why don't we track down the animals that gave up their fur? By using the discarded bones of specific animals found at these ancient campsites as a proxy for the production of cold weather clothing, they were able to trace the wardrobe habits of both groups. It's an incredible example of using what survives, the bones, to map out what didn't, the fur.
The researchers' methodology was essentially a prehistoric detective investigation, executed perfectly in three really clear steps. First off, they used a massive faunal database to identify exactly which mammal families were roaming Europe during that specific glacial period. They needed to know what was actually out there on the menu. Second, they cross-referenced those animals with modern ethnographic databases. Basically, they looked at recent hunter-gatherer societies living in extreme cold environments today just to see which of those specific animal families they used to make winter clothing. Finally, step 3. They went back to the prehistoric record to compare how often those specific clothing animals showed up in the trash piles of Neanderthals versus early modern humans.
So using the eHaraf World Cultures database, which thoroughly tracks the habits of recent human societies worldwide, they identified these specific mammalian families as the absolute go-to choices for crafting specialized cold weather gear. Deer and cattle families make up the bulk of the material, which makes total sense for the main body of a heavy coat or a pair of thick pants. But look closely at the other animals on this list. You've got Mustelidae, which includes wolverines and weasels, Leporidae, which are rabbits and hares, and Canidae, foxes and wolves. These three families combined make up a massive chunk of traditional cold weather clothing materials for people surviving in the absolute most extreme environments on Earth today.
Which brings us to the crucial point in this whole investigation. When we actually look at the fossil records left behind by both of these hominin groups, do we see a difference in the types of animals they were hunting? To figure this out, the researchers rigorously analyzed 333 different archaeological strata across the continent. They separated the layers of ancient trash left by Neanderthals, which academics call Moostrian, from the layers left by early modern humans, known as Aurionatian and Gravitinian. They were specifically looking for a difference in how often those top specialized clothing animals popped up in the campfire debris of each group.
And the numbers here reveal a massive, statistically significant gap. While both groups hunted deer and bison at roughly the exact same rates, the behavior sharply diverges when we look at the other three families. Early modern humans were hunting canids, leporids, and mustelids at vastly higher frequencies than Neanderthals did. Now, you might be thinking, well, what if they were just eating them? Actually, the researchers accounted for that too. Ethnographic data shows humans rarely, if ever, eat wolves, foxes, or wolverines. I mean, honestly, nobody is hunting a wolverine for a quick snack, right? These are notoriously dangerous animals, and they were almost certainly being targeted primarily for their pelts, not their meat.
But why? You might wonder why wolves and wolverines in particular were so heavily targeted by early modern humans. Why risk tangling with a dangerous predator when a deer is right there? Ethnographic data from modern Arctic groups tells us exactly why. Their fur makes the absolute best trim for parka ruffs. You know, that critical ring of fur around the hood that protects your face? Imagine breathing heavily while running or working in sub-zero winds. The moisture from your breath freezes almost instantly. But the varied hair lengths in mustelid and canine fur naturally disrupt that boundary layer of air around your face, heavily slowing down the wind velocity. Plus, it easily sheds ice and hoarfrost from your breath, which keeps the fur from freezing into a solid block of ice against your skin. In extreme wind chill, a fur ruff is literally the difference between keeping your face and losing it to frostbite.
And that brings us to the absolute smoking gun of this entire prehistoric investigation. When the researchers drilled down into the data to look for one specific animal, an animal whose pelt is universally recognized today as the undisputed king of parka ruffs, they found something completely astonishing: the number 0.
We are talking about the wolverine. Out of 96 Neanderthal strata analyzed across all of Europe, researchers found absolutely 0 wolverine remains, not a single bone. Meanwhile, 56 early modern human sites contain them. Contemporary trapping organizations and indigenous Arctic groups alike will tell you that wolverine fur is just too long and heavy to make the main body of a coat. It really only has one specialized, highly effective use, creating a freeze-resistant ruff around the face. So the complete and utter absence of wolverines in Neanderthal sites tells a very powerful, very specific story about their technological limitations.
So, what's the verdict? This glaring lack of wolverine bones, combined with the overall lower frequency of fox, wolf, and rabbit remains, strongly supports the hypothesis that Neanderthals only wore simple cape-like garments. They simply were not targeting the specialized animals required to create highly insulative, fur-trimmed clothing. Early modern humans, on the flip side, were systematically hunting these specific, super difficult-to-catch animals to craft complex, fitted parkas with wind-breaking ruffs. They were engineering their clothing to survive. What you really should take away from this is how these totally different approaches to the cold impacted their daily lives and their ultimate survival chances. Neanderthals had the ultimate home field advantage. Biology was entirely on their side. They evolved in Europe. They had stocky, cold-adapted bodies with relatively short forearms and lower legs, perfectly designed to retain heat. Early modern humans, having recently migrated from Africa, had taller, leaner bodies adapted to tropical conditions. On paper, they should have been at a severe, perhaps fatal disadvantage in glacial Europe. But our ancestors brought an incredible technological advantage: highly insulative, tailored clothing. And in the brutal reality of an Ice Age winter, technology beats biology. Every time.
There's this great direct quote from the researchers that really hits the nail on the head. Early modern humans' physiological advantages were outweighed by their technological advantages. Why this matters so much is that survival in the Ice Age wasn't just about not freezing to death while you slept. It was entirely about efficiency. With warmer, tailored clothing, early modern humans could drastically expand their daily time window for foraging. They could hunt longer in harsher winds, survive in higher elevations, and push into higher latitudes than Neanderthals ever could. This technological edge heavily increased their daily caloric return rates. Consistently getting more calories means better health, which directly leads to higher reproductive success. Slowly and inevitably, this gave early modern humans the demographic upper hand in a fiercely competitive environment.
So as we wrap up this explainer, we are left with a pretty profound question. Could a technological tweak as simple as adding a wolverine fur ruff to a coat be the exact reason we survived and Neanderthals didn't?
It's entirely possible that our ancestors' ability to deliberately innovate their wardrobe, to observe their harsh environment and systematically hunt for the perfect materials to shield their faces from the bitter wind, was the tiny evolutionary edge